I want to talk about wildcrafting and wild harvesting and forage, because at some point, as we're working with the plants, the herbal movement is happening. I just read something how there's been a 500% increase in importing of herbs and spices in the last 5 years. And it's gone from $1 billion industry to a $5 billion industry. And the awakening has happened. The dream that kind of I had and many people had, and not just me, but it's like to awaken using healing plants plants and herbs for healing and to take care of ourselves. And so now we have a different problem. We have, how are we going to meet the need of all of this awakening of the hearth, right? Of this awakening that's happening, of so many people wanting to use the amazing healing medicines of the plants. And so at some point, you can pretty much, you can order dried herbs, but at some point you're probably going to want to use fresh herbs. And so what does that mean? So I just want to talk about a couple things that for us to think about when it comes to wild harvesting and what that means. And I want to just open that up. I want to hear what you think about it. I would like to start a conversation about wild harvesting. What do you think what kind of rules do you think we need to have? What kind of ethics do we need to live by? How do we hold each other accountable, right? So I think it's going to become a bigger and bigger topic. And over the years, I have definitely seen stands of plants that used to be there that have been overharvested and are no longer there. And so I think this conversation is going to become more and more relevant. I would love to hear what your thoughts are about wild harvesting. And so there's I'm going to talk about 3 things to just think about today. And so one thing is, do you think it's okay to travel and harvest wild plants? Do you think it's okay to travel to different counties or different states or different areas and be able to harvest wild plants? And so, I'm not going to go into what I think right now. I'm going to talk about some of my experiences and just get this conversation going. So one thing I know is that, when I first started wildcrafting in the mid-1980s, I started making medicines for my clients for sale there was really, again, it's not like it is today. People there, there were not massive choices of tinctures in the stores, right? You had to travel to go find, and the internet didn't exist. And so I started making medicines for my community. And I started to get attached to certain medicines that I wanted, right? And some of those medicines I would have to travel for. Like every year I would travel. So sometimes I would travel to go get Larea tridentata, chaparral, or I would travel to go get yerba santa. I traveled to get St. John's wort before my garden got going. And what I learned from that experience is that when you travel, like you said, travel 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, sometimes I would travel more to go get that herb that I wanted to make that medicine. And you travel there the same time that you went last year, and you get there and the herb is not peak. It's not in the same place that in its growth cycle as it was at the same time last year. And what I've learned from harvesting in my garden and harvesting plants for 30 years is that there is about a 6-week window of difference. There can be so let's say last year last year an herb was ready to harvest on March 15th, but this year it could be ready to harvest on March 1st or April 15th. So things aren't ready to harvest it at the exact same time every year. And so again, 30 years of experience of harvesting wild plants, harvesting plants grown in my garden, that's one of the considerations, especially if you travel, is that you put a lot of effort into traveling. You know, I used to travel to get yerba santa. I used to travel to get yerba manza. I used to travel about 8 hours to harvest yerba manza. Now I just grow it in a pot in my house. But, you know, it's like, it's not going to always be in the same stage of growth every year. So you do all this traveling, you get there and you're like, I need this plant. I just did all this traveling, but it's not at the right harvest time. And so that's when people start to kind of like not do exactly the right thing. You know, well, I'm here, I'm going to just harvest it anyway, right? And the other, so that's one thing to consider of why I think, you know, it's good to really learn about the plants that we can harvest where we live, in our garden, and around where we live, because we can really keep an eye on when it's ready, right? It's not going to always be ready at the same time. And you know, unless you can call somebody and say, hey, you go check on that chaparral for me, see if it's ready before I come down there, right? So that's one of the considerations when you think about traveling to harvest. The other thing to think about is that, you know, you can't really keep an eye on it. You can't really keep an eye if you're going to do, you know, there's really some ethical issues now with the disappearance, with so many people wanting to forage and wild harvest. We really have to be able to keep an eye on the places that we harvest. And so if you just, you know, travel around and just pick and harvest everywhere you want, you can't really keep an eye and track what's happening to that stand that you're harvesting from. And so that's why it's so important to, I think, harvest regionally, harvest where we live, so that we can, from year to year, notice, is the stand that we're harvesting from thriving? Is it increasing, or is it diminishing? Because really, if you're going to be harvesting a wild plant, it really is our responsibility to make sure that the conditions are there, that the plant stand increases or thrives, you know, at least stays the same. And you can only really know that if you're able to see the stand of plants on a regular basis. Okay, so two things I've talked about. One is the problem with harvesting, traveling when you harvest, because you have no idea if when you get there the plant's going to be in the phase that's really optimum, because every plant has an optimum time, like a peak time when you harvest it, right? And that peak time, that window sometimes is very narrow. Some, you know, some of the plants like evergreen trees and stuff, I mean, you can harvest them any time of the year, but there are some flowers and some leaves that it's like there's an exact peak time, and when you travel you can't always tune into that. The other thing that we're talking about is that when we're traveling and harvesting, you can't really keep track of your stand, of the stands of plants. You're not around them enough to notice if what you're doing is having a negative impact or if it's really helping to maintain the health of the plants. Okay, so we're talking about wildcrafting, wild harvesting, being able to have access to fresh plants. And now that we have hundreds of thousands of families onboarding into the herbal world, wanting to know how to use herbs and plant medicines to take care of ourselves and our family, this conversation of wild harvesting, wildcrafting, foraging is a really, really important one for us to have as a community. And I'm going to be talking about it for a while today and going. So the Earth Wisdom Thursday, I'm here every Thursday at 4 p.m. And so, yeah, the other thing that you want to think about if you're considering harvesting a wild plant, something that's not growing in your garden, something that is, you want to think about the abundance of that plant and really start to think, how abundant is this plant? So there's multiple layers to that piece, and that's the piece that, okay, is this plant abundant like everywhere? You know, like plantain. Plantain is abundant across the entire planet. You know, probably could never overharvest it, okay? Or is it a plant that's just locally abundant? So let's say it just grows a lot, like in your area. So you go up to Southern Oregon, and let's take Oregon grapefruit, Mahonia, for example. That plant is everywhere in Southern Oregon. It's just like for you to tell them that that plant is endangered, they're just like, whatever. However, when you go outside of that region, it's a little hard to find. So it's a locally abundant herb. So does that mean you can just harvest it willy-nilly like you would plantain? I don't know. I mean, that's like, what do you think about that? Okay. And so you have to know if something that you want to harvest is locally abundant, if it's regionally abundant, or let's say it's just, let's say it's a plant that's, it's dispersed, like you kind of see it everywhere, but it's not really abundant anywhere. And so that's what I see now with California poppy. So California poppy 50 years ago used to have an incredible regional abundance, right? It was, I mean, the stories of the poppies of the hillsides that looked like fire. You know, I've heard that from multiple sources. But there are very few hillsides that have that anymore. The poppies are just, they used to be an incredibly local, abundant local plant, but now it's just kind of, you know, they're around, they're abundant, but they're not in, you know, there's not a lot of them. I mean, there's not like massive quantities like there used to be. So you also have to think about not only this distribution of abundance, but what was it like before? What was it like before the grazing, the clear cutting, the overdevelopment of housing, you know, just the environmental destruction that we're dealing with. So it's, you know, it's more than just, oh my God, I love that nettles, I want to pick it, or oh, I want to harvest this or that. We really have to have a broader understanding, a deeper understanding of the environment and the earth and just what's happening where these plants grow. And we have to have an historical perspective also. And we have to have our mind on the future. How is our harvesting going to impact this plant? Because we need the medicinal plants, right? And if you've been with me for any time at all, you know that my real belief is that every family, every community really needs somebody on board learning how to use herbal medicine if you want a truly proactive healthcare plan in place. Because otherwise, what are you going to do? You're going to rely on over-the-counter meds. You're going to rely on what the doctor says. I'm not against doctors or medications. However, we need access to it all. And herbal medicine is a truly proactive piece of our healthcare because it really helps with prevention. So again, there right now are hundreds of thousands of families onboarding into the herbal world because they figured that out. They figured out that, wow, I don't want to just give my kid Tylenol. I don't want to just give my kid Motrin. I don't want to, you know, like I need to learn how to prevent colds, how to help colds not last as long, right? So there's lots of people learning about herbal medicine right now, much more than it has ever been in my lifetime. And so we really have to have this conversation about where are the plants coming from. And so it's really, these issues, these three issues that I've talked about around wildcrafting, what do you think? You know, what do you think the rules should be? You know, yeah, hi Lydia, yeah, you're welcome. And I think I'm going to just be talking about this a lot more. I saw a Facebook feed a couple days ago where somebody said, hey, I'm coming to such and such an area. Anybody know of any wild foraging places? And I just thought, you know, that's how we get into trouble. Again, what I've been saying, traveling, it's difficult to keep track of what you do when you travel. It's difficult to actually arrive at the exact time of when the plant is peak. So you harvest, the medicine you harvest isn't optimum, right? It's not at the optimum time. And you can't over time see the impact of what you've been doing. So these are the, again, we need to start having this conversation. And even if we can grow one or 2 or 3 medicinal plants ourselves in our backyard, in pots in our house, in pots on the deck or whatever, it's going to take the pressure off of the wild plants. And so the other really big thing that I'm encouraging and just asking, like, yeah, I'd love to just hear your opinion on this. It's like, what does it take to just even grow a few herbs, 2 or 3, and get to know those herbs first, right? Or get to know a few herbs that you can grow in your backyard that that you can fall in love with and really, really understand what they're for. So yeah, those are some of the issues. So then what if you've decided that, okay, this is a plant that grows where I live, I can track it, I can see the impact of what I'm doing, it seems really abundant, I'm aware that it's not only abundant in this, sometimes, oh my gosh, sometimes there are plants where you won't find it for hundreds of miles, and then you'll find these 3 hilltops where it's just everywhere, right? I see that with Aerodictian, Yerba Santa. It's kind of like here and there, and then you'll run into these, there's a few hills in a couple counties that I know where it just seems like this plant is everywhere, but it's only really there. It's only really abundant there, right? And so does that mean it's abundant if it's really abundant in only one spot? And if everybody's interested in it, how long does that one spot of abundance last? So, okay, so let's say you found something that's like abundant in more than one place. It's nearby, you feel like you can track it, you feel like it's been in abundance for a long time, and you want to harvest some. How much should you harvest? So like what percentage of a stand of abundant plants should you harvest? And what should you do before that? So should you find out whose land it's on? Should you try to talk to anybody that has a historical perspective, like, somebody that maybe from the California or the Native Plant Society in your state, or a lot of times there's arboretums at the universities. Like, try to get to know people that have a long-term perspective about the abundance of the plant in your region, right? Okay, so you want to also just get that kind of a historical perspective. And so let's say you've done a little bit of work around all that. I want to know, like, what, can you harvest 5%? Can you harvest 10%? And what if you harvest 5% and the next person comes along and harvests 5%? And then the next person comes along and harvests 15%. And the next person, you also need to know if there are other people harvesting where you're harvesting. So I know many stories like that where people in our area have had kind of their harvesting areas or areas that they've been tracking and harvesting from for years. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, with this incredible awakening of interest in herbal medicine, all of a sudden their stands that they've been cultivating and tracking and caring for are gone. There's like 10% left of what they had been tending to. So it's really something, this is an issue. And so, again, I'm really interested, how much do you think we should harvest if we think we have, and should we start creating regional groups or regional guilds that can, just like kind of find out, like really keep a record of everything that's growing and who's harvesting what, right? So that's, it's an interesting topic. And so, wild harvesting, wild crafting, the art of going out into a place outside of your garden, not a park, not a garden, and going to the wild and harvesting your medicine. What do we need to know and think about if we want to do that. And so that's the question I'm putting out there, and I'm going to have us start thinking about. And I have lots of stories, lots and lots of stories. You know, it's and as herbal medicine becomes more and more popular, there's a lot to deal with. So I had somebody many years ago that she was tending a wild golden seal. Not wild. She lived in Missouri, and she lived on her family's land, and they were tending to a stand of golden seal on their land. They were replanting, they were increasing the size of the stand, and they sold just like 5 to 10% of it a year, and they were really taking care of it. And I happened to be on their list of people that they would sell it to once a year. And so once a year for many years, I got this package of gold in the mail of 1 pound of golden seal root. And I'm telling you, it was like this treasure, right? And I made medicine with my students and my clients, and I just, distributed it, to my community. And one year, she contacted me, and hey, Shirley, and she said, Cammie, I don't have any golden seal for this year. Someone came in the middle of the night and ripped all the golden seal out of our land. And so that kind of story, I've heard that story a lot, of different, about OSHA, golden seal, these wild plants that are really powerful medicine that are a little bit slow growing or need really specific conditions. And so we've been talking about what it means to harvest these wild plants. And we can just kind of take this and look at what it means for us as consumers. I also want to talk about what needs to be in place for us to feel comfortable to buy a plant. A lot of us, we have Mountain Rose Herbs, which does an incredible job of, really checking all that out. But it's not that way everywhere. And so we really, it's not about getting the most amount of plant for the least amount of effort, especially when we buy supplements. It's not always, you can't always depend on really ethical wildcrafting, ethical harvesting. And we really need to ask where our herbs are coming from. Is this plant organically grown? Is it ethically wildcrafted? Is it, who's harvesting, who's wildcrafting, is where it's being harvested from taken care of, right? And taken care of means that we are working with the plants in a way for them to increase or continue, exist, persist, regenerate, and not diminishing, not our main the extractive mindset that we have, the entitled extractive mindset that we have, that we can just take whatever we want without consideration. Because one of the things, Rosemary Gladstar many years ago, she talks about this in one of her books, how, when that whole group of people, like in the early 70s, the late 60s, started getting interested in the United States in herbs again, nobody had really been harvesting the medicines here. I mean, some people had, but not on a mass scale for 30 or 40 years, The eclectic herbalists were put out of business in the 1930s. World War II came. The pharmaceuticals started to, permeate everybody's brains with the chemist that was going to solve everything for you, and people just kind of went to sleep. And so when people started harvesting the wild plants again in the 1970s, ladies slipper was everywhere, and OSHA and all these plants that now are endangered. So we're not in the place of leaving these things alone for any time soon. So we really have to have this conversation about wildcrafting, wild harvesting. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are Should we be harvesting wild plants? If so, how do we do it? What are the questions we need to ask? How do we really stay in tune? How do we be respectful, ethical? And how do we hold ourselves accountable, right? How do we hold each other and ourselves accountable? So that's a topic for today: wild crafting, wild harvesting, foraging. I want to have this conversation about, we want fresh plants, right? What's the best way for us to get them, and for the amount of people that want them to get them?